Welcome to episode 28 of Conversations for the End. Today's guest is friend of the show, Dr. Robert Tyminski. Dr. Tyminski is a certified adult and child analyst, member of the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco, as well as a past president of that organization. His books include The Psychological Effects of Immigrating, a depth psychology perspective on relocating to a new place, Male Alienation at the Crossroads of Identity, Culture and Cyberspace, Crooked Lines, a short novel about coping with childhood illness, and The Psychology of Theft and Loss, Stolen and Fleeced. He is a two-time winner of the Michael Fordham Prize in 2016 and 2025 from the Journal of Analytical Psychology. Dr. Tyminski is currently finishing a book about clinical work with boys and young men, due to be published in 2027. It is always such a pleasure to have Dr. Tyminski on the show. I have always been a great admirer of his work, and as I did the last episode with him, and this one, I am an even greater admirer of him as a person too. I hope you enjoy listening to the episode as much as I did recording it. Dr. Tyminski was gracious enough to let me see an early part of his book that he will be publishing in 2027. So I was very, very grateful for that. That meant a great deal to me. Yeah, so we talk about boys and men and the struggles that they face. I won't go into it here. I'll let you listen to the episode. You know the drill, guys. If you're listening on Spotify, please go over to Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, subscribe, follow, whatever it is you like to do. If you're listening on Spotify and you haven't followed on there, please do as well. Yeah, that's it. Listen, I hope you're having a great day. All right. So let's get into the episode without any more wait. Dr. Robert Tyminski. Dr. Tyminski, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
So you were very kind, and you sent me a chapter from your new yet to be released book, Psychoanalysis. I'm going to say the title. We said that right. Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy with Boys and Young Men. So it seems like a trying topic to cover in these times. People talking about the male loneliness epidemic, all sorts of talk around boys, young men, and men in general. And I think it's a noble aim to go into that. So, on the subject of noble aims, perhaps, and aims, talk to me. Can you tell us a little bit about this idea of the heroic code?
Yeah, so it's not, this has been around for, centuries, this idea of heroism. And I think what a lot of Jungians have done is explored it as an archetypal theme that shows up in myth, also folklore. Currently, you see it a lot in film. You see it online. You see young men like constantly thinking about like how strong they have to be, what's okay to show in terms of emotions. They're usually the code, the traditional classic heroic code breaks down into strength and bravery. Not showing any shame, no tolerance for shame, extreme loyalty to your comrades. So it's not a hyper individuality. It's really about being part of a group. Excuse me, already my voice is playing tricks on me. And stoicism, that's the other piece. So just this idea then that you have a restricted range for emotion, that you don't want to appear feminine. And that's really part of the offset here, is that code kind of also enforces a certain gender line.
Okay. Yeah. And you say in the book, there's a quote here which I like. Boys and young men often try to convince themselves of their invulnerability by tolerating pain and regarding their skin as armor, a defensive shield. This belief also reflects how they usually view their psyche as likewise behind an impenetrable barrier. This relationship to the body and the psyche in terms of this kind of heroic code. I know you go in the book, you were going to look at this idea of the body. Generally speaking, if I mention that, the psyche and the body in boys and men, what are the first things that come to your mind in how they interplay and interact with each other?
Well, the ideal body, excuse me, sorry about this. The ideal body is typically very much something in boys and young men's mind, and they don't just get it from the gym, right? They get it from social media, from movies, from somewhat from books, although they're not terrific readers. A lot of boys and young men, many are. I don't want to be stereotyping here, but the body. I mean, the reason that I put that idea in the first chapter is that I'm hoping in the book to keep kind of bringing up the way that boys and young men relate to their body, and I've been struck by many. The example that often comes to my mind is. Many times I've had a teenage boy come into my office from some sports activity like soccer or wrestling or basketball, and they'll have a bruise or a cut, and they'll often be kind of, it's usually on their knees or on their arms, somewhere visible that you can see, and they're often trying to disregard it. They try and pretend that it's not existing, and so at some point I might say, well, looks like you hurt yourself or something like that. And what I'll get back is, no, it doesn't hurt. It's not really a problem. I've had this happen even when a boy might be bleeding, so the blood is like dripping down their leg or something, and they're telling me, no, it's fine. I'm really okay. And usually they'll come out with the dude word and say, dude, don't worry about me, and I'm okay. So that's telling us something about a relationship, right, with the body. And it's not dissociative in the sense that there is some faint awareness of it, but it's kind of, you might think of it as almost like in the unconscious near the surface, right? It's not deeply down, although some boys who have body dysmorphia and eating disorders, it is further down. But what I'm talking about is like just it's kind of, it has to be an awareness if you look at it because it's visible, but there's a resistance to doing that because they have to somehow acknowledge that they might be in pain or there might be something that hurts, and they don't want to do that. So it's kind of like a little bit the ostrich defense, right? You put your head in the sand and you're just like, no, I'm not seeing that.
Yeah, and do you think that correlation between the unwillingness to look at a physical wound and to acknowledge perhaps its actual impact is correlated naturally to the kind of psychic wound that James Hollis obviously talks in Masculinity about the wound that cannot heal in men. Do you think it's linked to that? It's kind of unconsciously this kind of that is the emerging pattern, and if so, what benefit do you think men and boys would have from acknowledging the limitations, perhaps, and the vulnerabilities of their physical bodies, be it through wounds, be it through their ability to bench 100K at the gym or whatever the targets are for the teens nowadays? Do you think there's a correlation there?
Well, I can tell you've read a lot of psychology, Chris. So, because it completely, in my mind, correlates. It's something about, again, this idea of the Stoicism. There is one kind of emotion that heroes tolerate, and usually that's pretty obvious, right? It's anger. But pain is something different. There's something about like trying to, kind of muscle your way through the pain. There's that old saying. I think I even grew up with it: "No pain, no gain." And so it's sort of this idea again that you have to learn a tolerance for it, and that does then have psychological resonance because that part of the psyche that's obviously going to be experiencing some pain or some bodily sensation, there's a walling off of it, and you could think of that as being somewhat dissociative, but it's also a defense. It's a kind of putting it behind a wall and creating an internal barrier to that experience. And so I think the correlation is pretty strong, and it usually is somewhat surprising to me in these situations when a kid has gotten a little bit more used to being in therapy or analysis, or a young man, and might say, "Hey, do you have a tissue?" Or hey, can you get me some water?" or something like that, because then there's a little bit more of getting behind that wall psychologically and recognizing that if you're in pain, you might need help. And so you can see there's a conglomerate behind the wall, that it's not just to not just talk about pain, it's to be self-reliant in a way that is really counterproductive. I mean, if you're bleeding on someone's couch, right, you might think that, yeah, you need some assistance.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting there how the idea of a kind of physical act can be a bridge perhaps into a symbolic act of the psyche. You mentioned asking for a tissue there in a therapy session as an example, and again I draw from the great James Hollis when he gives an example about a man who was in therapy with his partner, I believe, or he'd been sent to therapy by his partner. He was reluctant and kind of abrasive from the beginning, and Dr. Hollis noticed how he was focused on a box of tissues on the table, and he said, "I won't be needing them." And Dr. Hollis realized in that moment that this guy is probably not going to make it through these sessions because he's afraid of a box of tissues. He's afraid to reach out to show, if he was to cry, that would be a sign of weakness. And yeah, the idea of perhaps that barrier being broken down in men and boys to then reach for something like that, or to something as simple as to ask to be hydrated, you know, can be an acknowledgement that something in their psyche is working away and is changing. Yeah, that
Well,
is interesting.
that's kind of a funny idea, isn't it? That hydration would be associated with the feminine. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it
I
says something about the psyches of men in modern day, and symbolically, we need the waters of the feminine, I think, in the masculine psyche, and we need to find a way to bridge that. So on that little segue of bridging, you talk about in the book people's difficulty, and you give a case study, but the difficulty that many people, I imagine, in kind of modern Western culture, and perhaps particularly men, have with symbolisation. And
mhm.
symbols obviously kind of act as this, a bridge of sorts. Can you, firstly, before you explain what you mean about when someone struggles to symbolize, can you explain the difference for our dear listeners between a symbol and a sign to set us up?
Uh-huh. I have a feeling you've asked this before.
Probably not, actually, which means I'm always going in blind, and people are like, "What's he talking about?" So I'm trying to
It's a
set it
good
up more.
question. It's a no, it's a very like analysts, I think in particular, are pay a lot of attention to this idea. A sign is usually something very we think of it as tangible, like a stop sign telling us to stop, or a sign that says to yield. So in other words, the sign has an instruction. It's pretty clear what the instruction means. There's almost like a one-to-one, you internalize it, and you kind of know what it means. So signs usually indicate meaning, direction, something in the physical world that needs attending to. Symbols are quite different, and symbols, I love the word. I didn't know this until actually I started my Jungian training. I got interested in where the word symbol comes from, and it's a Greek word, symbolon, which means to join together, to put something together. And so what they used to do, apparently, is a way of like communicating with people, so that if there was a message that needed to be sent, somebody would have half of this and the other person would have the other half of this. And the way that they would be recognized would be when they met and they fit together, so that the two pieces fit together. And that was where this word comes from. So it actually means a physical joining together. And it's kind of like how children begin to learn about the world. So children understand signs before they understand symbols, but they often begin to understand symbols through their bodies. And so there's something about for instance, an owie that then calls for attention, and then they have to have some idea in their mind about needing help and who could help. And so you begin to put different things together that start in the body. And so this idea of symbolization, I think, is actually a developmental process for adults, teenagers, and even to some extent for children. It's this idea that it has two things are joined, and it can have multiple meanings. There's a great word called polysemous, which is sort of a bit of a, think of it as being kind of an elitist word, but it's kind of gets to the idea of multiple meanings, that something really isn't just defined the way a sign is. So in other words, stop means you stop. Well, if you have, for instance, a stained glass window with a star in it, that doesn't necessarily mean the sky. It could mean the sky, but looking at that stained glass, it would depend on the colors, the time of day you were looking, the kind of church you were in. So you would have all kinds of different associations to that stained glass window, and that idea of this multiplicity, that it's not just one thing, that's what a symbol is in contrast to a sign. So it's really that richness. The other thing about a symbol, which I'll say, is it can't be pinned down. So you see this in dreams, like often I'll have patients say, well, what does that mean, in a dream that they've just told me? And they want to treat it as a sign. In other words, they want some kind of direction or indication from the outer world to guide them on some inner experience that really is up to them to decide, and can't be pinned down in that way. And so when I often say, well, it depends or something like that, I'll get, especially if I'm talking to a young man, I'll get an eye roll or like, oh, that's not helpful kind of reaction. But that's the other thing about a symbol is that you can't quite pin it down. It would be like the star in the stained glass window, that there could be many interpretations about what it means, and those can change over time.
Yeah, and it seems very much a symptom, following the Enlightenment. We go into the kind of post-alchemist, the birth of modern science. Our ontologies as kind of Western civilization came out of that. And it seems both to your point of reading symbols and also to the point of not being able to take a non-definitive answer seems a symptom of that ontology of modern science, of things are this, matter is nothing but this. the universe is nothing but this. It's trying to explain
Hmm.
away everything in a kind of binary kind of thinking. It seems that has been part of our loss of ability to symbolize. So when someone struggles to symbolize their experience, let's start with the kind of in the clinical setting. What barriers does that bring, do you think, for people?
Well, to use the example of a dream, when somebody comes in with a dream and they're not able to work with it, they're not able to extrapolate and kind of make their own meaning about it, and they're looking online or in a dictionary of symbols. I mean, now there, I think, are even dream apps, dream interpretation apps. That's saying something about the inner agency being lacking. And so you'd wonder, what is it that's so hard, right, to be able to make your own meaning out of something in a dream. So for example, that looks like an eclipse on the wall behind you. Is that right, the picture?
It is technically it is an eclipse, yeah. So I don't know why I went. See, even I went definitively there based on my own kind of way of
Uh-huh.
thinking. It is an eclipse, and I also see it as the symbolic black sun. So it has
Yep.
that kind of
Okay.
those connotations to it.
Wonderful.
Yeah, but go on.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. So suppose you had a dream about that image and you came in and you were to say to me, "Oh, I had this dream about an eclipse," and to insist that it was just an eclipse. Well, think of how much that would narrow the field for you, for our conversation, for other possibilities, and for this whole idea of what it might mean to have something in a dream where the light is being covered, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that shadow or that something dark and malevolent or evil. It can just mean that you're trying to open a door into something new. And so that would be an example where the lack of the symbolic comes into a clinical conversation in a way that limits it. The other place where I see this is often in thinking about relationships. And so for example, if somebody's describing a love triangle, this this comes up a lot with teenagers and young adults. So you hear these stories, right, about love triangles, and we all have had, well, most of us, I think, shouldn't say all of us, but most of us had some. I know I had a tragic experience with a love triangle, and both in high school and in college, I seemed attracted to them. But but there's this thing about the triangle that also is somewhat symbolic. In other words, it's about three. So it's not just you and me. It's about there's this other third, and then there's a sense of, well, how is that going to affect what's going on between the three people? And that's a much harder, if you think about it, kind of harder uh, cognitive but also symbolic task to take on, because it could again mean so many different things. It doesn't necessarily just have to mean a jealousy and a kind of revenge sort of situation. It could mean, that there's something more fluid happening. And so this idea of these love triangles that often people try and settle in their minds as, well, they did this to me, I don't love them anymore, and the person that interfered is a bastard or something like that. That's definitely a little bit of a non-symbolic. There may be truth in that too. I'm not saying there isn't, but it's a little bit of a non-symbolic way to understand something that happened. Whereas to look at it and say, well, I kind of was being a jerk to her or him, and then they went and met this other person, and that other person seemed like they could do something I couldn't do. You see, there's other things that come in, and so those other things make it a little bit less of an actor and a victim kind of dialogue.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think as well from my own experience of kind of unpacking my personal myth over a lifetime. Um, Full disclosure, mine is that I have Don Juaned my way through life and had a sort of checkered
Why am I
relationship.
not surprised by that?
I have had a checkered relationship with women, and I have, you know, I was a terrible person in many ways, and I know there's different. I was talking through this with a friend last night, actually, and I know there's different versions of Don Juan. One in which he is
Yes.
confronted with the man he killed. He doesn't repent for his sins, and he is dragged to hell, effectively. And I could have been living in that quite easily. And for various reasons, various experiences, I have been able to see the myth, then start to engage symbolically with my psyche, do the work, so to speak. And I believe I have a much more open, reciprocal kind of reverence for the feminine now that isn't born out of my own selfishness. I had the
Mm-hmm.
reverence before, most definitely, but it was definitely driven by selfishness. But seeing that and being able to frame that in that way through that story, seeing a kind of redemptive arc, one that is still ongoing, it's not completely put to bed, if you pardon the pun, it it gives life richness and depth, doesn't it? And I think it allows people to perhaps see that their life is one of the greatest stories they could ever read, effectively, at least in my
Mm-hmm.
opinion. Did you find that when people start to unpack their stories, when they start to be able to symbolize and they start to see the myths they are perhaps living in, they can see the archetypal patterns, does it bring a clarity, a richness that kind of imbues their past, perhaps also their present and their future with sort of additional meaning?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just thinking, I don't know that we'd ever say that Don Juan quite becomes an angel, right? Um, but there is something to the story that you're using it in a way to make a meaning out of a relationship pattern that you saw, and to try and, think about, like, well, what that might mean for you. It doesn't mean that you are Don Juan. It means that there's something in that story that you can relate to. And so that in and of itself is a way to play with it. And playing is often symbolic. I mean, that's usually when you think there are different kinds of play. In children, there's solitary play, and then often they move into something called parallel play, and then there's competitive play. But those are typically less symbolic activities. Think about playing a board game. I was having this conversation with a child psychotherapist recently about how board games can be used defensively, and they really are a way to shut down anything kind of more creative. Now, you can make them creative if you make a board game together with someone, that, for example, and there are creative role-playing games. I've heard a lot about Dungeons and Dragons recently. So there are ways to do that, but playing has often got a creative and symbolic aspect in it. And so what you were just talking about with Don Juan, that has a playful, right? There's something playful about it, even though you might have at times wished, yeah, that it have a different outcome, or that it not feel a certain way for you, but that it's playing with the story. And so that usually is an indication of a symbolic process. I think it is a little bit. Jungians have this. I'm trying to think how to frame this. Jungians have Jungian analysts and psychotherapists. Often people are drawn to them if they dream a lot, have an active dream life, and it can be really wonderful. But it's a little bit like what Hollis described with the Kleenex box. That, in other words, a person can bring in a dream and dump it on you and then just leave it. And so then when you try and open the conversation about it, or you try and explore it, try and get them to talk about what other meanings it might have, you often, there's a fair number of people who struggle with that step. And for them, it's usually there's some issue around symbolizing that's difficult for them. So,
Yeah, and I guess maybe for anyone listening who struggles to symbolize or still has no idea what we're talking about, in the book you talk about how you focused on helping a patient develop an emotional vocabulary, one with feeling words that he could use in conversation. Now, I guess that seems like a crucial missing step, perhaps for many boys and men, is that before they can start looking at their dreams and swimming in the waters of the unconscious and active imagination and all the bells and whistles, they need to figure out a word that describes how they're feeling, generally speaking. What
yeah.
advice would you have for people who perhaps struggle to articulate their inner world?
Um, well, I have this funny uh, feeling chart in my office. I've used them for years, and so the school that I used to be the head of here in San Francisco, most of the students in it were boys, like probably 90% of them. And we had these feeling charts all over the place, and that was partly to help them see a visual. These are like, you know what I'm talking about. These are faces, right, of different, so happy and then sad and then angry, all these different faces. And some of them, I mean, there are many variations on these feeling charts. Some of them are with photographs, some of them are just drawings. And so I have a couple of these in my office, and they're on a table, but they're not on the top of the table. They're underneath, but you can see the shelf they're on. And I've often been struck by a man picking up the feeling chart and looking at it and saying, "This is really helpful." and and I just say, "Yeah, it really, it is helpful." And it's like opening a door, because there's something then about like seeing that there are all these different feelings and putting words to them that you think about what we were talking about, several minutes back, with this idea of the stoicism, and that it could create this inner wall. And then what gets hidden behind the wall, or what's in the eclipse, to go back to the image on your wall. What is it that can't be seen? There might actually be light to be shed on it. And if it's the emotional life, if it's the feeling world, then often what a person needs help with is a vocabulary for that. And so I don't mean this to sound basic, because it's actually not basic. If you think about somebody who doesn't have that, they're usually suffering. And there's usually a sense of like, why can't I put these things into words? It can be very frustrating and painful. So I don't want to make light at all of that. But like acquiring that emotional vocabulary sometimes is a little bit of a two steps forward, one step back process, because it does mean going inside and going into a more internal orientation of developing a perspective where you're looking inside yourself and you're trying to say what's going on in you. And that often can be um, misinterpreted as being feminizing or effeminate. And again, that seems a really uh, I want to say almost tragic sort of outcome. Now, there are a lot of schools, and we have moved on, so I'm not trying to paint a picture that this is all kind of a bit gloomy, but schools with social emotional programs for boys, so where they work on this and help them to develop those muscles, mental muscles early on. And so that usually is of great benefit. What surprises me is when I still encounter boys who've gone to those schools who are afraid of their feelings. And that to me is, again, a combination of their peer relationships, what they see on social media, what they pick up from their peers, and this archetypal heroic level. I do think there's something in the deep unconscious about this kind of heroism. It can be there for girls and young women too. I'm not trying to be binary about only one kind of gender would experience that, but for boys, it often means something about like, oh, like how deeply do I want to look inside? That could be misinterpreted by my peers, or I saw this YouTuber say, you just need to make your bed every day and get up and do 100 jumping jacks, and then make a to-do list, and that'll help you be a better man. Literally, I've heard stories. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about here.
Yeah. I mean, often in those manosphere kind of daily routine videos, there's all this stuff going on from about 3 a.m. to midnight, but there's not a single other person in the video other than the guy. And that is, I guess, a showcase of the lack of the inner feminine as a relational aspect to those around. Okay, I want to again just focus on this idea of the heroic code, that kind of heroic ideal that perhaps men have got from society, their fathers, the culture, movies, everything, books, you name it. And then going inward to kind of have the language to understand their feelings and to face their feelings, and facing those barriers because of that kind of mentality. I mean, one of the things, going on the subject of this eclipse, the reason why I have that there is partly because the show is Conversations for the End. It was originally going to be Conversations for the End of the World. And I realized it needed to be shortened, but that's the premise. And the eclipse is often a symbol associated with the end of the world, but as apocalypse, and as you have rightly pointed out, apocalypse is to reveal, right? So I always saw this as a conversations to reveal, effectively. So it feels like we're at the end of the world, but it can reveal new stuff. But also it has significance for me. It was a very, very prominent image that came up in I had a period of psychosis where I got very unwell. Prior to that, there was kind of like a prodromal phase where I had an encounter with the unconscious that was far more symbolic, a kind of forced active imagination. And the black sun came up in that very heavily in my dreams, started to come up in the hallucinations just before I probably tipped over the edge of losing insight and beginning a very difficult year of acute mental illness from that. But that symbol, again, has significance because the black sun is the kind of, we often imagine the sun, this is Stanton Marlin's book I'm drawing from. We think of the sun and divine energy as this kind of radiant, glowing, comforting presence. But the black sun, seldom thought of, which is, it's still a divine energy, it's still numinous, but it burns away. It burns away what no longer serves. When men are internalizing, when they are putting those barriers up and they're trying to articulate, you talked about how a patient equated depression with defeat. And that seems that is that heroic kind of ideal present. Now, for me, in that experience of effectively, for lack of a better word, going mad and being stripped down to when there was barely anything left through that kind of black sun, that soul Niger experience, that for me, it was a defeat in many ways. I had come to the end of I come to some sort of conclusion to what was my addictions at the time, that had unfolded in acute mental illness. And I was, on a surface level, if you were looking at my life as a sign, perhaps defeated. But symbolically, it was a stripping away. It was a reorientating of my life, of my perception, of everything. And the kind of the return from the depths in that moment was extremely transformative. I think it transformed my personality in 12 to 16, 12 to 18 months in a way that I hadn't transformed my personality in 15 years previous, effectively. Do you think that the reframing of these kind of lesser desired moods, depression, anxiety, things we might associate because if we pathologize them as weakness, reframing them symbolically how can reframing what men see as weakness have a benefit for them, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And thank you for sharing what you went through. I was struck by something you said because about the dark sun or the soul negrata, that there is a sense of transformation, that's what it's about. That in other words, you have to go into the darkness or the depths. And it doesn't necessarily mean death, or it can, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that. It doesn't have to equate with dissolution. That it's something about, I often think about it as burning away the binaries that trap us. That there's something about that dark sun that it can be transformative and liberating from all these binary kinds of associations that are inculcated in us, socialized, inscribed into us from an early age. The one that's relevant for our discussion, of course, is gender. But to your question, yeah, I think reframing something, and again, you would have to take into consideration how you reframed it and how the person could hear it, because if the person isn't so ready yet for working with the symbolic, then the reframe might be something around the emotional vocabulary. In other words, that they might feel defeated, but feelings rarely last. Moods are more persistent. That's why we call them moods. Feelings rarely last, and that a feeling can transform. So you introduce this idea of transformation into something else. So defeat can be also a way to show your resilience, to show your grit, to show how you bounce back. And so often that idea is one that I found works a lot. The other thing is that feelings have a volume level, an intensity level, and so that's another way to introduce something about, you might feel strongly about this right now, but maybe tomorrow you won't feel as strongly about it. And so it gets dialed down. So this idea of both the reframe, feelings can change, and then the intensity of feelings can also decrease, can increase if in ways too that can be unexpected. But those are often ideas that feel or seem more accessible to young men than something symbolic. Now, there are guys who can work symbolically, and so, as you were saying, with them it might be, well, what do you think this means? This feeling that you're having right now, what do you think it might mean about where you're at right now in your life? And having that kind of conversation can be, again, very creative.
Yeah. And with that process, obviously, this is often in a clinical setting. They've kind of got a container there. It's guided in many senses. You or whoever it may be can see the steps that maybe need to be taken to get to symbolic thinking, if that's going to have utility, like finding a more feeling orientated language, a way to articulate their affects, and their emotions. Where do you think this can happen, or how do you think boys and men can do this outside of a clinical setting, outside of therapy? Where
Mm-hmm.
can they find these spaces? This is a conversation, a topic that keeps coming up with the men that I speak to. A lot of the men are on this podcast that have come on, and I struggle to find my own answers.
Yeah. I mean, there are places like so often, like a book club, a film club, a game club. The clubs used to be a lot more taken for granted. I'm, there's this whole idea that their popularity decreased with the advent of smartphones and social media, because people have become more atomized and looking at their devices and less likely then to venture out. But there still are these things around, and often those are spaces that allow for a kind of creativity. So if I'm seeing a young guy who might be struggling with isolation, I'll listen to what do you like to do? What did you used to like to do? I often ask that question when you're around people. And if he tells me, oh, I used to like these silly games, and often again, these aren't board games, these are much more creative games. And there are lots of places, even bars, or I guess for you, pubs, that sponsor game nights and that sort of thing. And so you try and see if there aren't ways to move into those kind of spaces. It's the same thing with book clubs, film clubs, even some sports. Like there sports isn't all kind of rough and tumble, heroic, macho. There are kinds of really meaningful sports clubs that boys and men invest time in, and they form friendships in those things.
Mm,
And so that often is a place where that happens. So I think of those kinds of things. You have to hear what might be interesting, what might you like to do, and how could you find a space to do that in. And so it's a kind of exploration, almost. I sometimes call it a thought experiment, in a session. Like, let's think about this together. Let's think about what that would be like for you to go to one of these things. What would you want to get out of it? What would you want to bring to it? What would you be anxious about? So you often have to kind of look at those different things, the motivation, the anxiety, and then what their hope is. So I think there are places, but that is a problem, I think, now, that it's one of the unintended consequences of all these screens and devices. Like, so we're using it in a wonderful way, right? It's allowing us to connect across continents, to have a really interesting conversation, to talk about things that other people might be interested in hearing about. So that was the idealism of the internet. But then you look at the shadow side, and it feels like, really, to a lot of us, like the shadow side has been what's been ascended, that it polarizes people, it makes them more alienated, it creates this anomie where everybody's in their own silo. And so those are some of the struggles. So often a conversation about device use and screen use comes up too, like, how much time are you spending online? And do you think there might be a way to limit that for yourself and do something different? And I've actually found most guys are open to that conversation. I haven't really, I mean, I've had a couple of cases where there's been like an internet addiction, and that's different, because there you can't have this kind of conversation. You have to really think much more about what are the external supports that are going to help limit the person's compulsion really, or addictive behavior with the screens.
Yeah, I want to say a quick note on what just came up for me there, and then to finish, I want to go and talk about a little bit more about screens and particularly adolescent relationships as they are conducted through screens. But before I ask that question, I was thinking there, you mentioned kind of physical sports activities. I had jiu-jitsu ex-marine Jared Black on the show recently, and he's just started his Jungian study journey at Pacifica. And a lot of the stuff he is writing about there is around the mat being a sacred space. And when we got
Mm-hmm.
into that, we started talking about these themes of brotherhood, and particularly in the kind of drilling of jujitsu moves, the repetition, the kind of
Mm-hmm.
part of that, the sparring, the rolling, they call it. He said there would be these moments where you would see, two guys kind of, they would do a round, they'd finish, they'd sort of sit back in the gaps between the rounds, and there was this acknowledgement through the physicality and then the pause between, where they kind of could tell that you're going through your stuff, I'm going through my stuff. This is us working that out without speaking. And it made me think again that you put a lot of emphasis in your work on the body and its
Mm-hmm.
cues, and I guess its ability to not only tell us something about the psyche, but also perhaps to help metabolize difficult psychic contents. And I wonder as well if it plays into this idea how screens and technology have become more prominent in our worlds. We have become disembodied selves in many senses. We exist in the crossroad
Mm-hmm.
of cyberspace, right? And I wonder if these physical activities do bring us back into the moment, into this kind of, I don't know, maybe archaic is a bit of a stretch, but it feels closer to the archaic than the iPhone would be, or TikTok or something like that, right? So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think it's an interesting thought, one that I will reflect on more. So bringing this home, talking about screens there, talking about the internet, you've obviously covered this quite a lot in your work fantastically. With adolescence already kind of being a fragile stage of identity formation, perhaps lacking ritual spaces for initiation, this kind of liminal space between being a younger person and going into being an adult. What happens when identity is kind of constantly curated and judged through the social media sphere?
Yeah, well, it's a bit. Uh, I mean, you can think of it as having a transformative element, right? I think adolescence is a relatively new concept. I mean, I think, I'm always struck by the fact that when I read, like, I'm trying to understand some of these myths, that a young man or a young woman was considered 14 or 15. And so adolescence is, I think, I'm not exactly sure if it started as a concept in the 19th century, but it's relatively new, and so in human history. And so the idea of adolescence, posturing and preening and putting on makeup or trying out different hairstyles, jewelry and clothing, that's all part of, I think, a transformation that is exploring and experimenting with what a self can be. Right. So I think there's something about that, even on social media, that is useful and could be really helpful to young people. I'm less convinced of the term identity, psychologically. I mean, I think it does have demographic and legal meanings that we need to keep in place. But as a psychological term, Eric Erikson was the person that we studied when I trained, which was in the 1980s, but back then, and even even into the 2000s, Erik Erikson's ideas about identity formation were used. He actually, I got to meet him a couple of times because he lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he taught us a couple of seminars in the graduate program I was in. He was a really lovely grandfatherly man, very thoughtful and kind of graceful. He had a grace about him. But his ideas were really that there were two kinds of identity, that there was this adaptive, we might almost call it a normie or normative sort of identity, and then a more troubled negative identity. So it was, again, this binary. And that what you really, the idea was, it was based in ego psychology, was you really wanted to move towards this adaptive identity, that the negative identity was only going to cause you trouble, pain, and despair. So I don't think, that's just not where we're at and haven't been at for probably, a good 30 years. And so psychologically, I think there's more this notion of different self states that people are experimenting with and seeing how they fit, trying them on. And so again, some of this I think can be useful. It seems like it's migrated a little bit online, which we would anticipate and even understand. So where people are curating ideas about who they are, that's probably not terribly different from what teenagers did in the 1980s when they would come in with a new haircut and different kinds of clothes, and even be talking in a different way, trying to hang out with a different crowd. So there's a way in which it's just migrated, I think, into the online world where it becomes obsessive. I think that is problematic, because then there's a confusion. There's something about who I am online, on Instagram or Snap or TikTok. That's what other people see of me, and so that must be real. And that I think is a misunderstanding. That is almost like a collective delusion that we're all having now about something about the psyche being deposited online and having an existence there that validates who we are and defines us. I think that is really false. This is a tool. Like what we're doing right now is we're using a tool, but I don't think that there's any way that you or I would misconstrue it to thinking like, oh, now there's going to be some kind of, like, I don't know, extra validation or extra interpretation that's going to come from who we want to be by what we're doing by using this tool. So I think that idea of limits and separation is a bit problematic for adolescents and young adults who have grown up with the internet and smartphones. So I often hear stories about, like, they'll go to some kind of summer program. Some young person, let's say 19, 20 years old, goes to some summer program for a month, and they're told that they can only use their smartphone in restricted time. And then they'll come back and they'll tell me how liberating it was, or how surprised they were that they didn't miss it, and what a relief it was that they didn't have to be constantly checking their notifications. So there is this way, I think, in which we're entering something that's quite different in terms of trying to understand what it means psychologically, that isn't fully fleshed out yet. But this idea of depositing psyche online, I think I was giving a talk recently, and I said, what would be interesting thought experiment to think about, what would Jung have thought about this, or what would Winnicott have thought about this? In some sense, you could see it. Jung might have thought of it as participation mystique, that there's some way that, you see the object and then you have a fantasy about being equivalent with the object. That's literally what he meant participation mystique was. Well, he thought that that was kind of that happens for everybody. He said that, but that again, that's not really terribly symbolic because you're making something equivalent, you're equating something, an experience, a projection of who you are, a curated piece of, think of a photograph that we like of ourselves, right? Well, there's a reason we like the photo because it depicts a moment in time when we felt good about ourselves and we liked who we appeared in that moment. But when you have a photograph, right, you understand, oh, well, that's a photo. Well, now I think it's quite different with the constant stream of images that you can do now on social media. So that's a little bit different. And I think Winnicott, just to finish the thought, Winnicott might have been open to the idea of social media and screen use as a transitional space. But he was pretty clear that that was also a space that was mysterious and that in its best sense, like stays undefined. Well, I don't think that that's what's happening with what you were referring to with people curating their identity online. They're trying to in a way, hyper define and hyper regulate who they appear to be to others. And so that's no longer a transitional space. That's saying that the teddy bear is only a teddy bear.
Yeah, and as you kind of touched on, although these kind of things may be a thing that we have done for many years, like parading a new hairstyle amongst a group of friends, I did this video a little while ago on social media being kind of, the new town square. And if we were to say, hypothetically, go into the town square to have that social interaction with our peers to show off the new hairstyle, then we can, if that goes well socially or doesn't go well socially, we can kind of return home to the privacy of the house and lock the door and kind of reassess ourselves. Now, sort of twofold, you've got the fact that we have the magical object, as you refer to it, that
Mm-hmm.
now brings the town square home in our pocket when the door is shut behind us. And because of things like limbic capitalism, it's a compulsion that, our need to want to pick it up and look at it is the kind of town square bell going off 24/7, urging us to go back into that perhaps precarious landscape of social hierarchies and presenting ourselves, and if the haircut hasn't gone well in that situation, you're kind of stuck there all the time, right? And that seems like a particularly difficult place for young people to navigate. And I think I wanted to get more into some of the other stuff that you might be covering in the book, but I think maybe we can run it back again when the book is released, and I can get you on and we can talk
Sure.
about some other chapters. Dr. Tyminski, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for allowing me a sneak peek at it. Yeah, the work is fantastic as always, and I think it is. I said to you before, I think it is needed in these times for Jungian thinkers to be addressing these issues for slightly younger people, and bringing it into a contemporary lens. I think the esoteric and the mysterious and all this stuff that kind of
Uh-huh.
orbits Jung is great, and it has its place, I'm sure. But I think if we cannot utilize these Jungian ideas in the modern day for a younger generation, then what is it worth ultimately? And you are, one of the pioneers of doing that in such an effective way. So
Oh.
very, very grateful for you, for your work and for you coming on the show. Where can people find you currently?
There's my website, which is just roberttyminski.com. And then if they're interested in any of my books, including the new one will be published by Routledge, that it's just the routledge.com website. And they can probably also get it through local bookstores. So those are always good venues. They can be ordered that way.
Is there a release date on the new book yet, or a general area we can expect to
So
maybe see it?
it it will probably come out either late this year or very early in 2027. So I have a draft manuscript right now that I'm tinkering on with my my intrepid copy editor who keeps me in shape and is really a godsend. So that's what I'm going to be spending much of the spring and summer, I think, is corresponding and going back and forth with her. So I also wanted to say, really appreciated the Dark Sun. So I think that you can see like that brought something into our conversation and kind of transformed it. So again, that's a really great image.
Yeah, it's my kind of way of subtly, subliminally putting this kind of transformative symbols into the podcast. So, I've got people watching, and little do they know,
Yeah.
right behind my shoulder, the work is being done on them in the unconscious. A bit of a bit of the trickster archetype coming out there.
Yes, very
Yeah,
positive trickster.
I do my best, not always, but I do my best. Dr. Tyminski, again, thank you so much. It has been an
Yeah,
absolute
thank you,
pleasure.
Chris.